So today we're going to talk about the Elephant Man. Now, if you go to your books, this is in the book, page 118. Now this is a recount written by Sir Frederick Treves, or Trews. I always thought it was Trews. Could be Treves. Now he was actually a doctor who caught on to the fact that the Elephant Man was performing, and he ended up kind of rescuing him and giving him a slightly better life than he otherwise would have had. It was a pretty awful story. I mean, let's read through the intro, and then I'll give you some background on it. Descriptions can form part of a recount. They give the reader a clearer image of a place, a character, a reaction, or a feeling. Descriptions give information that appeal to the reader's senses of sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste, and in some cases, emotions. In the early 1880s in London, people with handicaps and gross deformities were usually not cared for at all. Often they ended up in freak shows. This was what happened to John Merrick. He was born with an illness that caused his skin and bones to form large outgrowths on his body. He had lived a decade or more of his life as an exhibit, called the Elephant Man, in a freak show until a doctor, Sir Frederick Treves, found him and took him to the hospital. So this is the doctor's recount. Now, we're talking about the Victorian era. Freak shows were they were all sorts of anyone that looked a bit different could qualify for a freak show. They used to have strong man, just big man, fat people, hairy people, even foreigners would qualify as a freak because people didn't travel, there was no TVs, people hadn't seen anything that looked different, so anything qualified. So this guy, John Merrick, was pretty awful. He looked terrible, nasty smell to him from the decaying flesh. And even to this day, no one is really sure what was actually wrong with him. Medical science, unfortunately, we haven't caught up to it. We don't know what was wrong with him. There's no chance of getting DNA. His skeleton is still in the museum, as far as I know. I know at one point Michael Jackson was trying to buy it. That actually happened. I don't know if he actually bought it. But it's, as far as I know, it's still in a museum. But unfortunately, the bones were cleaned and the chemicals used have destroyed any DNA. So we have no idea to this day what was actually wrong with him. His deformities were, interestingly, multiple. His bones were deformed, and also his skin was deformed, and he had different kinds. He had bony growths and sacs of skin. So two different things. We just don't know. What's really sad is that he was at least of normal intelligence, so he knew what he was going through. It's a pretty tragic case. He spent most of his life being ridiculed, laughed at, hated, reviled, and there's nothing else he could do. He could barely walk. People couldn't understand him when he spoke, and he looked horrible. And it is human nature to be repulsed by things that are different. That's perfectly normal. I know these days everybody tries to tell you we've all got to accept difference and diversity. Human beings aren't built that way, and that's okay. You're programmed to be repulsed by horrible things. You recognize ugliness because you don't want it in your future DNA. You don't want your children to be appalling. So you're generally disgusted by things that are very, very different and very ugly. So people who are born with severe handicaps, missing limbs or other deformities, we don't find that attractive. And we're not supposed to, because it's protecting us from interbreeding with them so that this stops. It keeps the human genome clean. And that's fine. That's how we're built. I know these days we try and pretend everybody's equal, and we're not. We're not. It's okay to be repulsed by things that are repulsive, It's human nature. What's not okay is treating somebody like this. There's a difference between not wanting to date this man and treating him as a sideshow exhibit where he was never given any kind of respect. That is not okay. He was clearly a normal man, and he deserved a normal, as normal as it could be, a normal life. He did eventually get one. The doctor rescued him. I have seen much more of the story than we're going to see here. We're going to look at a documentary about it tomorrow as well. So this is just going to be an introduction today. He was rescued, and he did live out his life in the hospital, which wasn't as bad as it sounds. He had his own room. He wasn't treated as an experiment for the rest of his life. He was treated with respect. So the early part of his life was the hard part, and after he met the doctor, things did get much better for him. What's really tragic is the way he died. According to the story, he was given a grooming set. He was given a grooming. No one saw that coming. He wanted a grooming set, clean his hair and all that kind of stuff, just to feel normal. So they bought him one. They gave him one, and it pushed him over the edge. It made him realise that no one really knows. Nobody really knows what happened next, but he wanted to be normal, and obviously he wasn't. And he couldn't sleep on his back. He had to sleep in a certain way, otherwise the bony growths would close his throat and kill him. And that's what happened. He laid down on his back one night and died. No one knows if he did it deliberately. No one knows if this was an act of suicide or if he just was trying to be normal. Nobody knows. But he died. He at his own hand, quite sad. He just wanted to be normal. But of course, don't we all? So, pretty tragic story. He wouldn't have been able to eat. He couldn't sleep, couldn't walk. His arms were essentially useless. One of them. I think he had one good arm. He had a pretty awful life. No quality of life. And he remains today a famous object of medical curiosity. I would like to think today he would have some sort of care. People like this are better looked after. I'm not sure that they're much better looked after. Of course, today, the whole idea of people's appearance has changed. Now we only judge people on the surface. So in Victorian England, this was a freak. People would pay to go and look at him because he was ridiculous. Now, of course, we accept the surface, but we don't accept anything else. So modern day freaks are usually crazy people who actually need help, and all we've done is substitute out people that look different for people who think different. Now, free thinkers are the new freaks. That's progress. So, let's go through the section. I'm going to read this to you because it's just easier. Then I want you to go through the questions 1 through 10. And this time, you're going to have to put those into the attendance on Google Class. You're going to have to fill these out and return them to qualify for attendance, because I know that a lot of you, I know you haven't been doing them, so I want them done, otherwise you didn't attend the class and you will get 0 for attendance. We're going to have to be much harder on that. I've tried to be nice and it hasn't worked, so we're going to have to be quite strict. And tomorrow, I think we'll go through the documentary, because it is fascinating, it really is. His life was just dreadful. So today, I'll do a reading, and I've put some pictures in as well, so you can see what he looked like. There was a very, very good film back in the 80s, award-winning film about his life, shot in black and white. We're not going to watch that, but I would recommend it. It is actually a very, very good film. It's beautifully made. It was David Lynch, a very, very gifted director. So I would definitely recommend that one if you're interested in this. But we'll do the documentary tomorrow, and you'll find out a lot more about him. And it is an interesting story. And as I say, this is how people who looked different were treated then. Now we accept people who look different, but we don't like people who think different. Along Mile End Road, opposite the London Hospital, there was a line of shops. Among them was a vacant greengrocer's which was to let. A hanging sheet of canvas hid the entire front of the shop, except for the door. This canvas sheet carried the announcement that the Elephant Man could be seen inside the shop, and that the price of admission was 2p. Painted on the canvas was a life-size portrait of the Elephant Man. This rough portrait showed a creature that could only have been possible in a nightmare. It had the figure of a man, but the characteristics of an elephant. From the painting, I had imagined the Elephant Man to be of gigantic size. However, he was short, and was made to look even shorter by the bowing of his back. The most striking feature about him was his enormous and misshapen head. A bony mass, shaped like a loaf, stuck out from the brow. It was so huge that it almost blocked one eye. A bag of spongy, fungus-looking skin, which looked like a brown cauliflower, hung from the back of his head. On the top of the skull were a few long, lank hairs. The circumference of the head was almost equal to that of the man's waist. Another mass of bone projected from the upper jaw. It protruded from the mouth like a pink stump and turned the upper lip inside out. This growth from the jaw had been exaggerated in the painting so that it appeared to be like an elephant's trunk. The nose was merely a lump of flesh, only recognizable as a nose from its position. The face was incapable of expression. The back was horrible. Huge sack-like masses of flesh hung from it and extended as far down as the middle of his thigh. The flesh was covered by the same cauliflower skin as that on the back of his head. From the chest hung a bag of the same repulsive flesh. It was like a dewlap suspended from the neck of a lizard. The right arm was huge and shapeless. It was also overgrown with hanging masses of the same cauliflower-like skin. The hand was large and clumsy. It looked more like a fin or paddle than a hand. There was no distinction between the palm and the back. The thumb had the appearance of a radish, while the fingers might have been thick, tuberous roots. As a limb, it was almost useless. The other arm was remarkable by contrast. It was not only normal, but it was delicately shaped and covered with fine skin. In addition, it had a beautiful hand which any woman might have envied. The lower limbs had the characteristics of the deformed arm. They looked swollen and were unwieldy and grossly misshapen. To add a further burden to his trouble, the wretched man had developed hip disease when he was a boy. This had left him permanently lame, so he could only walk with a stick. He was thus denied all means of escape from his tormentors. As he told me later, he could never run away. One other feature must be mentioned to emphasize his isolation from others. Although he was already repellent enough, a very sickening stench, which was hard to tolerate, arose from the skin growth with which he was almost covered. From the showman, I learned nothing about the Elephant Man, except that he was English, that his name was John Merrick, and that he was 21 years of age. At the time of my discovery of the Elephant Man, I was the lecturer on anatomy at the medical college opposite the shop. I was anxious to examine him in detail and to prepare an account of his abnormalities. Therefore, I made arrangements with the showman to interview his strange exhibit in my room at the college. I became at once aware of a problem. The Elephant Man could not show himself in the streets. He would have been mobbed by the crowd and seized by the police. He was in fact as secluded from the world as the man with the iron mask. When I eventually brought the Elephant Man to the college, I made a careful examination of my visitor, the results of which I presented in a paper. I made little of the man himself. He was shy, confused, very frightened, and evidently much cowed. Moreover, his speech was almost unintelligible. The mass that projected from his mouth blurred his utterance and made the articulation of certain words impossible. He returned in a cab to the place of the exhibition, and I thought I'd seen the last of him, especially as I found next day that the show had been forbidden by the police and that the shop was empty. I assumed that Merrick was imbecile and had been imbecile from birth. The fact that his face was incapable of expression, that his speech was a mere spluttering, and that his attitude was one of whose mind was void of all emotions and concerns were reasons for this belief. The conviction was no doubt encouraged by the hopes that his intellect was the blank I imagined it to be. That he could appreciate his position was unthinkable. Here was a man in the heyday of youth who was so vilely deformed that everyone he met confronted him with a look of horror and disgust. He was taken about the country to be exhibited as a monstrosity and an object of loathing. He was shunned like a leper, housed like a wild beast, and got his only view of the world from a peephole in a showman's cart. He was, moreover, lame, but had one available arm, and could hardly make his utterances understood. It was not until I came to know that Merrick was highly intelligent, that he possessed an acute sensibility, and worst of all, a romantic imagination, that I realized the overwhelming tragedy of his life.